I studied business law because I thought I would be able to walk into a well-paid job once I had finished my university. Then I graduated and reality hit. I couldn't find work and I was spiraling deeper into debt. My rented apartment was always cold and a dark, disgusting mold caused by dampness was spreading across the ceilings and walls. It was the pits. One gray morning, I just had to get out of the apartment for a while. I had enough money for a coffee, so I found a cafe nearby. I settled into a corner, opened up my laptop, and went back to my search for a job. The coffee tasted good. The cafe was buzzing with the conversations of the other customers, and I started to feel better. When I clicked on a post, I saw about a vacancy for an assistant archivist. My mood lifted even more. The position involved cataloging and caring for an extensive collection of diverse and valuable objects held in a national archive. When I was growing up, I used to dream of working in a museum or a library. Owning a secondhand bookshop and being surrounded by dusty tomes was another daydream when I was a teenager. There was something romantic to me about old objects. They were my geeky obsession. And then I grew up and went down the path of business law. More fool me. As I read through the essential requirements for applicants to this job, and I was able to tick them all off, I started to wonder if maybe things were going to work out for the best after all. Taking my time, I worked carefully through the form. I added all the numerous details asked for, which included checks for a criminal record, and tried to sell myself in the process. Come on, you've got to at least give me an interview, I said under my breath, and I pressed send. And then I waited. I knew that I shouldn't get my hopes up too much, but I couldn't help myself. I started constantly checking my messages for a positive response. I even did this in the middle of the night, as if some fellow insomniac who worked in personnel was going to email me at 3 o'clock in the morning. A week dragged by and then another. I continued applying for other jobs, continued freezing my butt off and watching the mold spread, and I slowly gave up on my dream job. I mean, what had I been thinking? I was a complete loser who would die on my own, and nobody would know until the smell got so bad that the neighbors would call the cops. They would probably find me decomposing and huddled over my laptop, still waiting for a reply. I sighed and stared at the screen, and a new email appeared. It was a reply to my application for the assistant archivist position, and they were inviting me to come for an interview. I celebrated by going for a walk and buying the cheapest drink that the coffee shop sold. The following day, I was standing in front of an anonymous-looking building on a quiet street in a business district on the outskirts of the city. This was the address that I had been given in the email, and it had not been easy to find. But I had made it, and feeling dizzy with nerves, I went in. There was a bland lobby with a reception desk next to a series of gated entrances that led through to an open space, where I could see a row of elevators and a handful of people waiting by them. No one was staring at their phones like they would be everywhere else. I soon found out why. When I signed in at reception to get my visitor's pass, I was told that I had to leave my phone in a secure pouch. I would be able to get it back when I left. That struck me as overkill. I was an unemployed graduate, not a spy. And besides, what could there be here that was so secret? Wondering this, and with my visitor's pass on a lanyard around my neck, I passed through one of the gates. Close up, I could see that it was similar to a security gate at an airport, and I could tell that the receptionist was checking a monitor on their desk. No alarms went off, so that was a good start. A man was waiting for me just past the gate. He looked like a corporate type in his business suit, and I assumed that he didn't work directly with the objects in the archive. His face was as bland as the lobby, and if I had been asked afterwards to pick him out in a police lineup, I think that I would have failed. He introduced himself as Mr. Jones and said nothing else as he led me into one of the elevators. From there, we went up 2 floors and into a small windowless office, where 2 more nondescript men in suits were waiting to interview me. The interview itself felt very intrusive. I was asked about my family, my relationships, and my personal politics and beliefs before there was any mention of my degree and previous professional experience. There was no opportunity for me to ask questions, and I did not learn anything more about the archive. After I had been grilled, I was thanked and told that they would be in touch. Back out on the street, I loosened my tie and went for a walk to clear my head. I thought that I had done well at the interview, but I was no longer sure that I did want this particular job. There was nothing else on the horizon, but maybe I should focus on finding another opportunity. I was thinking this when I got home and found 2 separate notices that had been pushed under my door. One was from a credit card company threatening to sell my account to debt collectors. The other was from my landlord telling me that I would be evicted if I did not pay my rent. I was still standing there in a cold sweat when I heard back about the interview. They were offering me the job and the starting salary was enough to dig me out of the hole that I was in. I forgot about all my concerns and completed the contract and non-disclosure agreement that came with it and sent them back. My hands were shaking by now and I decided that I needed something stronger than coffee to help me calm my nerves. I had another credit card that charged insanely high interest rates, but still had a small available balance on it, so I used it to buy myself a bottle of bourbon. I still had a hangover when I started my new job 2 days later. I signed in at reception and this time I was met beyond the gates by an older man. He had unruly white hair, looked like he had dressed in the dark, and was carrying an old leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Dr. Miller and said that he was going to be my supervisor. I followed him into an elevator and as he pushed one of the buttons, he said with a smile, "Say goodbye to the daylight." The elevator began to descend. All of a sudden, I felt way too hot and I could taste stale booze. I swallowed the bile that had risen into the back of my mouth and tried to look as if I was not about to pass out. I also made a solemn vow never to drink again. The elevator opened onto a dimly lit space with a high ceiling. Closed doors lined a long passageway that stretched out farther than I could see. "Welcome to the archive," Dr. Miller said. "The administrators, the accountants, and the managers are all based on the floors above ground level. And this is where the action begins." He grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. It was my first day, and even though I still felt dreadful, I wanted to appear keen. So I smiled back and asked, "How many levels are there down here?" 35. I was so surprised that I almost swore out loud. He must have been able to tell that I was flustered because he chuckled and said, "Oh, this place is quite the iceberg. The majority of it is below the surface and never seen, apart from by the likes of you and me." And then he laughed again, and with a sweep of his hand, he indicated that I should follow him. As we walked, he talked about numbering systems, catalogs, and divisions and subdivisions and cross-referencing. By the time we came to a halt in front of one of the doors, my head was spinning. Dr. Miller took out a key card, pressed it against a reader to open the door and said, "Let's get you started in here." Inside the room, dozens of shelves lined the walls and they were all packed with old books. My inner geek punched the air in triumph. I was still looking around in awe when I realized that Dr. Miller was speaking and I tuned back in. He was saying, "The archive itself dates back to 1947. It began on a much smaller scale and until the 1960s was held in a single warehouse. Once it outgrew those premises, it was moved here, and when the available space was again filled, it was decided to expand downwards rather than relocate. I was in the dark about so many things to do with the archive already, and the snippets that I was learning were making me feel even more ignorant. I wanted to know who was paying for all this, and how had such a sizable archive stayed under the radar for all these years. I decided to keep any more questions to myself for now though. There were clearly some serious layers of secrecy in the place here, and I didn't want to risk my new position by saying the wrong thing. Well, at least not until I had earned enough to pay off the worst of my debts. I smiled at Dr. Miller and simply nodded along as he explained what he wanted me to do first. My job as an assistant archivist began with a less than glamorous task. I was to take the books off the shelves and dust them. And along the way, if I encountered any bugs, I was to kill them. I was told that I couldn't use any kind of bug spray as this would damage the bugs, but Dr. Miller did hand over a dust mask and a stack of cloths. I had more questions now. Did I get breaks? Where was the restroom? What kind of bugs might I encounter? Were they a type that were partial to people as well as paper? But I had no one to ask. Dr. Miller had left me to get on with it. I sighed and I looked at the shelves and the books. Yeah, this was going to take forever. I thought about the alternatives again. Debt collectors kicking my door in, unless my landlord had already thrown me out onto the street and I no longer had a door to kick in, and that gave me the motivation to get started. I removed a book, coughed and sneezed at the dust that was thrown up, and I remembered to put the mask on. The rest of that day made me forget about my hangover. Instead, I felt lousy in many other ways. My eyes were red and itchy. My back hurt from moving books. After the first 100 or so, they had started to feel like gym weights. And then the stream of bugs had also scurried over my skin and through my scalp. I was convinced that I had accidentally swallowed a few as well. By the time that Dr. Miller came to tell me I could finish work for the day, I was utterly miserable and grossed out. I caught the subway home and sat there scratching myself. The other passengers kept their distance and gave me dirty looks, and I didn't blame them. The next morning, I returned to my task, and thankfully, I started to get used to the conditions. I was coughing and sneezing less and got much better at squashing bugs before they could reach me. Things improved so much that I started to check out the contents of some of the books as I took them from the shelves. There was a book about dowsing, a book about cryptids that included chapters on Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, and the Jersey Devil. One of the older books was about alchemy. Another was the first in a 12-volume edition on magical curses. I also found a book about medieval justice, describing in detail how to hang, draw, and quarter someone. It was not written in the style of a history book. It was much closer to a how-to guide. It was grisly and engrossing. By the end of the day, I was spending more time reading than dusting. Dr. Miller seemed fine with the progress that I had made anyway. The rest of the week passed easily enough. At the weekend, I applied for a loan to tide me over until I got paid. Now that I was in full-time employment, the banks and credit card companies were only too happy to help me. On Monday morning, I arrived at the archive with a spring in my step. Dr. Miller told me that I had a new task as the elevator took us deeper into the archive. The corridor that we stepped out onto was shorter and led to a single shutter door that slid up when Dr. Miller pressed his keycard against the reader. A light flickered on automatically as we stepped through the door into a vast open space. At first sight, it looked to me to hold scrap metal. There were dozens of large, dark remnants laid out before us. Maybe of vehicles, maybe of some kind of aircraft. I didn't know. As I followed Dr. Miller deeper into the space, I saw that the remnants were getting larger. The edges of some looked sheared off. Others appeared to be crushed in places. I got the feeling that I was looking at the results of crashes. Fast, violent collisions from the damage visible. Once again, I had plenty of questions, but I kept my own counsel and hoped my supervisor would explain. We had been walking for about 10 minutes though, and Dr. Miller was saying nothing. Remnants now towered above us, their geometry seeming stranger to me by the minute. We stopped alongside one massive dark slab. It was sleek and circular and seemed to be complete. I was transfixed by it and had forgotten Dr. Miller was there until he cleared his throat and said, "Some of the things stored here date back to the earliest days of the archive. The object that we're looking at was acquired in the late 1950s. It was measured and photographed for our records at the time." He opened up his briefcase, took out a small device and added, "I would like you to use this 3D handheld scanner so that a digital image of the object can now be created. Oh, it's nothing complicated. You point and press." As Dr. Miller handed over the scanner and then headed off deeper into the space without further explanation, I looked at the scanner and hoped that he was right. I pressed a button and a panel on top of the scanner lit up green, and I went for it. There were no joints or openings in the outer surface that I could see as I made a circuit of the object. There were no markings either. I got the feeling again that this was some kind of aircraft, a high-tech, latest generation spy plane or drone perhaps. And then I remembered that Dr. Miller had said this object was from the 1950s, but it looked far too advanced. I kept puzzling over what this thing was and kept scanning it, until the light on top of the scanner had started flashing red. I had no idea why, but assumed it was because there was a problem with the scanner. I tried tapping it and then turning it off and on again. The red light kept flashing. Having exhausted my technical expertise, I decided the best thing to do was go find Dr. Miller. I set off walking the way that he had gone. There were more mysterious remnants scattered around, and I could also see lengths of tarps draped over the floor here and there. I knew that I should ignore them. I knew that if I did, my life would be simpler. I could find Dr. Miller, get the scanner working again, and finish my work for the day and go home. Maybe I could stop off in a bar on the way and have a cold beer. Maybe flirt with the waitress. But curiosity got the better of me. I stopped by the end of a length of tarp. I saw that it was very dusty, as if it hadn't been moved in a long while. I leaned over and lifted the end of it with one hand. There was a box underneath. It was about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. The top of the box was made of a clear material, and inside of it was a skeleton. My first thought was that I had stumbled across human remains, and then as the initial jolt of shock had passed, I saw that the proportions of the skull were all wrong for a person. The cranium was enlarged and the eye sockets were also way too big. I remembered images that I had seen on late-night TV shows with small budgets and words like unexplained and phenomena in the title. They were enjoyable but trashy and completely made up, or so I had always believed until now. I stared at the bones. I thought about the complete craft and the remnants, and about the period from 1947 through the 1950s. It was the golden age for alien encounters and UFOs. With all sorts of crazy ideas swirling around inside me and buzzing with excitement, I hauled the rest of the tarp off. I swore under my breath. There was another box, the same dimensions as the first one, and it had that same clear top. But this time there was flesh on the bone. The body inside had gray skin. The gray was very light in tone and the skin wrinkled. The head was once again enlarged. The long wide eyes at its base were closed. I would have given anything to have seen them open, for me to have the chance to communicate with what I was convinced was an alien. But from the state that it was in, I could tell that I was staring at a corpse. I covered it back up. I didn't want to look at the bodies anymore. I also didn't want to admit that I had been snooping, so I decided straight off that I was not going to say anything about the bodies to Dr. Miller or to the waitress at the bar, to which I was definitely going to go after work, because man, did I need a drink now. I wiped cold sweat from my face and turned away. I could hear footsteps and saw Dr. Miller wandering towards me. "Problem?" he asked. I almost did blurt out the truth, but managed to hold back and just told him that the scanner seemed to be acting up. He frowned then and said, "Oh, I'll take it to a technician later to be fixed. In the meantime, come with me. There's a lot to do and not enough people to do it." I was happy to follow him and get out of there. Dr. Miller continued to be friendly but distant over the days that followed, and thankfully I had no more disturbing encounters. By the end of the first month, I had told myself that there was likely a mundane explanation for the bodies in the boxes. They were props from an old movie or fakes from a traveling carnival. The so-called spacecraft and the rest would be something similar. I just hadn't thought what yet. At the time, I was also busy spending my first paycheck. I paid installments on money that I owed and then bought myself some snazzy new clothes and went out and had a good time. The next Monday morning found me stumbling into work, trying to remember where I had been and what I had done. I was hoping for a quiet and uneventful day. Dr. Miller greeted me and dashed my hopes, though. "We are very happy with your work so far. I am pleased to be able to give you your own key card. I hope the responsibility won't go to your head." He chuckled as he handed over the key card, while the only thing that happened in my head was a new stab of pain. "Now let's get to work," he added far too brightly. I trapezed after him to an elevator and we descended into the archive, deeper than we had before. The elevator shuddered to a halt. The doors opened and we stepped out into what looked to me like the hallway into an apartment building. There was worn light brown carpet and a series of doors on either side. Each had a small laminated number fixed to the outside. There were buzzers, peepholes. It felt old and run down, and unsettling. Dr. Miller seemed fine though. He was opening the nearest apartment door and going in. Not sure what else to do, I went after him. I found myself in a small living room. There was a TV on in the corner showing a game show. The TV and the game show both looked to be about 40 years old. There was an angle-poised lamp resting on a table placed next to a recliner. They had all seen better days, as had the man slumped on the recliner. He was middle-aged and wore a white vest that was covered in stains, best left unidentified. His exposed shoulders and the top of his back and chest were covered in thick, gray, matted hair. His fat gut hung over an undone belt, below which he was wearing baggy shorts. His feet were bare and filthy. His eyes were open and he was staring at the TV with a glazed expression on his face. He had not moved an inch since we had walked into his apartment, and he didn't react as Dr. Miller took a thermometer out of his briefcase and then walked up to the man and held the device against his ear for a few seconds. After taking a reading, Dr. Miller lowered the thermometer and muttered seemingly to himself, "No change. Good." And then he ambled out of the apartment, leaving the man as we had found him. I once again followed my supervisor and caught up with him in the apartment directly across the hallway. The decor here was also stuck in the 1980s. There was a sofa in the center of the room facing a TV, this time showing a soap where all the actresses had shoulder pads and blonde perms and the actors wore braces and striped shirts. A man and woman were slumped on the sofa, mindlessly watching events unfold on the screen and oblivious to myself and Dr. Miller. He was busy checking them with the thermometer. When he had finished and again seemed pleased at his findings, I could not stop myself from asking, "Are they in a coma?" No, Dr. Miller replied. They are in a unique state. This couple and the gentleman across the hallway and the residents of the other apartments were participants in an experiment. They were provided with free food and drink over a number of years. In return for this, all they had to do was have regular medical checkups to see what effects their diets were having on them. The food and drink you see all contained intensely high levels of preservatives, and this was the result. These people are, strictly speaking, neither alive nor dead. Thanks to all the chemicals they ingested, they are preserved. I could see into the eyes of the couple on the sofa. There were no signs that they were perceiving anything. But why are they here? I asked. Now I had started asking questions. I could not stop. And why are the TVs on and showing old shows, and why the furniture, the hallway? And Dr. Miller didn't seem to mind the barrage of questions and answered calmly. Once the experiment was complete, the subjects and their environment were acquired for the archive and moved here to be stored exactly as they had existed in their old apartment building. It means we can perfectly preserve the preserved. He chuckled as he said this. I was starting to not like the way that he laughed. There was a darkness to it, a hint of being unhinged. And Dr. Miller stopped laughing. He was smiling at me instead. I was not too keen on the way that he was doing that either. Now, he said, how about you check the temperature of some of the other residents to see if their preservation levels are remaining stable. He held out the thermometer. I looked at it for a moment, gulped, and then accepted it. I was very uncomfortable but did not think that I was in any danger. I was only doing my job, earning a wage, looking forward to letting off steam at the weekend. Thinking along these lines had worked before, and they did again as we entered a new apartment and I held a thermometer against the ear of a woman with big hair and an empty stare. Once we had checked everybody, it was time to move on to another task on another level. He pressed the button to take us back up to a higher level, and when we exited the elevator, I was relieved to see that we were in what looked like a reference library. There were wooden filing cabinets that rose high above us, and rows of shelves holding slim volumes. There was a single table as well. A young woman was sitting at the table writing something in a large hardback journal. She was maybe 5 years older than me and had long dark hair and green eyes. She was, I thought, beautiful. And Dr. Miller said, "Hello, Annabelle." The young woman looked up. "Dr. Miller, is there anything I can help you with?" "Not today, thank you. I'm just here to collect a catalog and then we'll be on our way." She smiled at me. She had a sad smile, and though I can't explain why, this made her even more attractive in my eyes. I was looking at her as Dr. Miller ambled off down an aisle, presumably to get his catalog. I felt awkward and knew it would help if I could say something funny or interesting. So I said, hello. "Hello, you," she said. "I'm a new assistant archivist. Well, I say new, but I've been here for over a month now. They've given me my own key card." I almost took the key card out of my pocket to show her, but I stopped myself. She would have already known that I was a complete loser from these stupid things that I had just said. I grinned weakly instead and wished that Dr. Miller would just hurry up. When he reappeared a few minutes later carrying a book, I followed him back into the elevator. The rest of the day dragged, and when I left work, I didn't go to the bar. I went straight home and sat on my sofa and looked at the TV. I had not turned the TV on though. I was thinking about Annabelle. I couldn't stop from thinking about her. She had gotten under my skin. The next morning, Dr. Miller left me alone with thousands of old paper files that had been compiled about suspected spies. Each folder held black and white surveillance photographs, a name, address, profession, and details of supposed espionage activities. From the dates included, I doubted many of these people would still be alive, but my supervisor wanted the files to be put in alphabetical order by surname, so that's what I did. It was hard to concentrate though because I was still obsessing about Annabelle. After a couple of hours, I couldn't stand it anymore. I left the files and I went to see her. I didn't know what I was going to say, and as I left the elevator, I immediately got cold feet. But it was too late to turn tail. She had seen me. I had to go for it. "Hey, I was just taking a break and was wondering if you would like to go for a coffee sometime." "Oh, thank you, but I don't drink coffee." "Not a problem. Perhaps iced tea, a cola, or maybe something stronger. We could go for a drink after work if you'd like it." She gazed at me with her bewitching green eyes for a moment before saying, "Oh, you're sweet, but going for drinks after work is not something that I can do." I had been turned down plenty of times before, but I was confused by her response. Sounding as puzzled as I felt, I said, "Not something that you can do." She smiled her sad smile and said, "No, I can go anywhere in the archive, but I cannot leave." And then she lifted her hair away from her neck to reveal a circular scar. "I have a surgically implanted transmitter. If I was to take the elevator to the ground floor, alarms would be activated. I would be detained and brought back down." My head was spinning. "Do you mean you're a prisoner here?" I managed to ask. "I am kept here. I'm allowed to certain libraries, such as to do my work in central records on this level. It's kind of dull, but it helps keep my mind active and passes the time in the day. In the evening, I go to my quarters, which are 2 levels down. It's small but comfortable, and I sleep well most nights." "But why? What have you done?" Her smile grew sadder. Her eyes drew me in. "It wasn't something that I did. It was something that was done to me. I was attacked by a werewolf and left with a curse running through my veins. I was soon captured by the authorities and transferred to a secure facility where I was studied. I think they were trying to harness my dark powers to use for their own devices. But they learned nothing and I became surplus to requirements. That's when I was acquired by the archive. At each full moon since then, I can still feel the call to change into a vicious beast. But down here, it is merely a torment. I do not transform and I do not bite. So you don't need to worry, even though the next full moon is tonight." I was lost for words, and when I did not respond, she said, "You best go back to work. I don't want you to get into any Dr. Miller's bad books because of me." I turned away and returned to the elevator. I didn't know what else to do. The files were waiting for me, and I tried to throw myself into the task. In the afternoon, Dr. Miller came by to tell me that he would be working late, but that I should finish at my regular time and then continue on the filing in the morning. I dredged up a smile and told him that I would see him then. I went to a bar after work, but just looked at my drink and left early. Back at the apartment, I sat on the sofa and felt weighed down by sadness. The next morning, I didn't want to go back to the archive, but I dragged myself in. I stood in front of an elevator and pressed the button. The elevator arrived. There were 2 men wearing dark suits and dark glasses inside. They were standing next to a medical trolley with a body bag on it. The bag clearly had something inside of it. There was no mistaking this. One of the men indicated with a wave of his hand that I should move away, and then they wheeled the trolley with its disturbing cargo out of the elevator and began to push it towards the gates. I stood there and watched. I told myself that everything was going to be fine. I would start working on the files, and Dr. Miller would arrive soon. I would be bored and would want to go and see Annabelle because she was all that I cared about now. The elevator doors were still open. I moved towards them but stopped when I heard someone behind me calling out my name. I turned around. It was the man who had met me before my interview. or one of the men who had interviewed me, I honestly couldn't tell. Sounding kind of breathless, he said, "There you are. You need to come with me." I figured the files could wait and followed him into an elevator that took us up 2 levels and along a featureless passageway and into a featureless room, where a man wearing dark glasses told me to take a seat. I started to feel sick. I thought that I was going to be fired. The man wearing dark glasses said, "There's been an incident. The body of your supervisor was found this morning on the lowest level of the archive by another member of the staff. Dr. Miller has been brutally killed. His skin was slashed open in a number of places. He had been bitten. Parts of him had been consumed. It was a mess. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" He may have been looking me in the eye when he asked me this. I couldn't tell. All I could see was the dark lenses of his glasses. I do," I managed to reply. The man continued, "Good, and now that I brought you up to speed, I want to reassure you that you'll be able to return to your assigned work as normal. You are in no danger." But the killer?" I asked. He replied, "There was only ever one suspect and we tracked her down easily. The wolf woman is now in custody and is being transferred to a Supermax federal facility." The room started to feel like it was spinning around me. I grabbed a hold of the side of my seat to try and hold on. They thought that Annabelle had killed Dr. Miller, but that couldn't be right. She had told me that the call of the moon was not strong enough in the depths of the archive for her to transform and lose control. I believed her and I knew what I had to do. I had to find the real killer to prove Annabelle's innocence. I went back down into the archive, to the lowest level, the end of the line. I stepped out of the elevator and saw a large number of wooden crates stacked on top of each other. There was a narrow passageway between them. I followed it. I had only been walking for a couple of minutes when I noticed that there was a strong smell of disinfectant, and then a small area of the floor that looked as if it had been recently cleaned. Whoever had done this had not done a thorough job. There was a dark smear to my left that I knew was blood, and there were more blood stains on the sides of the crates that lined the passageway where I stood. Blood had been spilled when Dr. Miller had been slaughtered. A shiver passed through me. I had felt increasingly uneasy in my supervisor's presence, but he had not deserved to die so brutally in this strange and lonely place. I clenched my fists, trying to find the courage to go on, but fear won out. I wanted to turn around and run. And then I thought about Annabelle. I pictured her face. I tried to imagine where she was at that moment in time. I tried to imagine how frightened she must be. I took a deep breath and moved forwards. The passageway between the crates continued. It grew narrower and narrower, and I started to feel claustrophobic. The crates seemed to be closing in on me, and I began to struggle for breath. Their sides scraped against me, catching on my clothing. I felt a sharp pain in my hand and saw that I had been cut on a nail which protruded out of the side of one of the crates. Cursing, I pressed on. And at last, I emerged from the crates. I was standing in an empty space. The air was thick with dust and the lights flickered on and off. I got the feeling that it had been a long time since anyone who worked for the archive had been here. I kept putting one foot in front of the other, though. Shadows danced erratically around me and my heart raced, and then I saw a door a dozen paces ahead of me and hurried towards it. The door hung open, and it was broken. Looked like it had been forced. I stepped through it and into a stairwell. A flickering light bled through from behind me, illuminating the beginning of treads rising to my right and descending to my left. I could just about make out footprints in the dust on the ascending treads, and I could hear a noise from higher up the stairwell, a growling noise. Whatever was making the sound was hidden from sight around a turn in the stairwell, but it was coming closer, getting louder. I started to retreat. I was panicking and not thinking straight, and I began to descend the stairwell. Within seconds, I was in complete darkness. Above me, still unseen, the growling continued. I could not go back. I had to keep descending. Moving blind and relying on touch, I made my way down through the pitch blackness, hoping to find another way out. Before long, it felt like I was at the bottom of the stairwell. Ahead of me, I could see the glow of a fire through an open door. I moved towards it and saw a man standing over the fire. He had his back to me and held his hands out over the fire as if he was trying to warm them. I didn't think that he knew I was there, until he muttered in a low voice, "Can't get no warmth in my bones, no matter how much I try." And then he turned around to face me. He was hideous. His skin was decayed. In places, it had rotted away completely and I could see the bone beneath. His bloodshot eyes bulged in his wasted face, and his long hair hung like dead weeds down to his shoulders. The hands that he had been trying to warm were more bone than flesh. Through my shock, I realized that he was wearing the ragged remains of a military uniform, and I began to notice more figures in the darkness at the edges of the room. They too were creatures of decayed flesh and bone. Some were stooped, some stood tall. I saw one of them holding a rifle. "Oh, don't worry about Corporal McKinley," the savaged man by the road said. "He won't shoot ya." I looked away from the rifle and I looked back at him. There was a grin on his grotesque face. "I'm Captain Paul Jackson. These down-at-heel fellows are what is left of the company I used to command, the Fightin' 54th. So many questions raced through my mind. I asked breathlessly, "Why are you here?" We were ordered to witness the test of a new missile. We were told that we would be safe from our observation point, but the moment the missile exploded and the heat and the dust hit us, we knew that they had lied to us. Wasn't long after that our skin began to darken and fall away. They took us to a hospital, one with bars on the windows and armed guards outside every door. Then after the dang medics had finished prodding and poking us, we were brought here. That was a long time ago, and we think the people that run this place must have forgotten about us, which is fine by us. We look out for each other and get by the best we can." He looked me in the eye while he spoke and kept his gaze fixed on me as he asked, "Hope you're not planning on changing that, son." "No," I answered hastily, and I explained who I was and about Dr. Miller and Annabelle and the hideous noise that I had heard. He looked thoughtful and said, "Oh, we knew there was something new up there, some kind of creature. Figured it had escaped from its level. But as long as it kept its distance, we were going to leave it be. From what you've said, it sounds like its presence could draw the management down here and spoil everything." And then he gathered himself up to his full height, straightened his shoulders and said, "The men of the 54th, let's go hunt down a monster." The ravaged man led the way. He and his company moved silently and confidently through the darkness. I kept to the rear. My nerves were shattered, my legs felt like they had been hollowed out, and I was mighty glad this strange band of soldiers were not my enemies. I reached the stairwell and followed them into the level where Dr. Miller had died. The ravaged man waved an arm in command and his men began to fan out. They swept slowly forwards in single file, their weapons ready to be raised and fired. There is no sign of a monster though, no sound. My clumsy footsteps were the only thing to break the silence as these stacked crates came closer. The passageway was there, a dark, narrow opening from which something was emerging. I froze, gripped by terror. The monster moved on all fours like an animal, but it had the form of a man. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over bone. Its eyes were red. Where its nose and mouth should have been, there was a single opening that was lined with needle-sharp teeth, and long claws protruded from its fingers and toes. Their scraping sound along the floor ceased as this thing became aware of us and stopped in its tracks. The ravaged man and his company aimed their rifles at the monster, its head tilted to one side as it seemed to study the intruders in its hunting ground. And then a growl drifted from the opening. Drool hanging from its savage teeth glistened in the flickering lights. I wanted to scream, but my voice had been stolen by fear. I stood there as the ravaged man calmly said, "Continuous fire on my order." He raised his right arm and I could see his bones through a gash in his uniform and thought again how glad I was to have made this strange alliance. He began to lower his arm, but before he could complete the signal, the monster threw itself forward with a shocking speed. It was on one of the soldiers before any of them could react. Its teeth drove into the flesh that remained on his shoulder, but he didn't cry out in agony. Instead, he said, "You can't hurt me, you freak. I got no nerve endings, but I've got plenty of attitude." He grabbed it by the neck and started to push it away. I could see his flesh being torn from his body where the monster still gripped with its teeth. He did not flinch. He threw the monster to the ground and stepped away, and his comrades opened fire. The monster's body danced under the onslaught, and when the ravaged man gave the order to cease fire, it was left decimated and very dead. As the soldiers dragged the corpse back towards the stairwell, the ravaged man turned to me and asked, "Are you going to tell the people that run the archive about this?" "I have to. It's the only way to save Annabelle." He once more fixed me with his undead gaze and said, "Then I can't allow you to leave. You will expose us more quickly than that monster would have." I put my head in my hands. I could have wept. After a moment, the ravaged man said, "There could be another way if you give us some time. We might be able to leave and find a new place to stay." My spirits soared and I said, "Yeah, and I'll help." "Deal," he replied and smiled and held out a hand. I looked at the bones and the decayed skin and told myself that I could do this. I reached out and shook his cold hand. "Deal." I made my way back through the crates to the elevator and returned to the files. The man wearing dark glasses came into the space while I was working. "Any problems?" he asked. I kept my voice steady as I answered, "Everything's fine, and I'm making good progress on organizing these files." He nodded, seeming satisfied. "We'll keep up the good work. Remember, there's an opening for a senior archivist now, and it is the kind of role that an enthusiastic team player would be considered for." I simply smiled at him as he laughed. He thought that I was a loyal employee. He was wrong. I knew that working inside the system would be the best way that I could achieve my aims. I would be patient, I would be careful. I would help the ravaged man and his company escape. I would save Annabelle. And if I could, I would bring the system down. Forget dusty old objects. I had found my true purpose in life.